Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and discovering that your country didn't lose a war. It didn't suffer a natural disaster. Its factories are still running. Its people are still working. But overnight, its currency has become harder to use. Its banks can't settle international payments. Foreign companies stop doing business, and prices begin rising. No bombs, no soldiers, no invasion, just money. That sounds impossible. Yet versions of this have happened more than once. For decades, the United States has possessed a form of power that doesn't rely on aircraft carriers or nuclear weapons. It relies on something people use every single day without thinking: the US dollar. The strange part isn't that America prints the world's most important currency. The strange part is that billions of people who aren't Americans still depend on it. And that dependence has quietly become one of the most powerful geopolitical weapons ever created. To understand why, we have to answer a simple question. Why does the entire world keep using someone else's money? Because at first glance, it doesn't make much sense. If Japan buys oil from Saudi Arabia, why should dollars be involved? If Brazil trades with India, why isn't each country simply using its own currency? If Europe already has the euro, why does the dollar still dominate? The answer isn't tradition. It's infrastructure. Imagine every country speaking a different language. Trade would become painfully slow if every conversation required a translator. So eventually everyone agrees to use one common language. Not because it's perfect, because everyone else already speaks it. Money works in a surprisingly similar way. The dollar became that common language. Today, around the world, companies borrow in dollars. Governments issue debt in dollars. Banks hold reserves in dollars. Ships carrying oil are usually paid in dollars. Airplanes, copper, wheat, natural gas, semiconductors. Even when America isn't involved in the transaction, the dollar often is. That's an extraordinary level of influence. But how did it happen? To answer that, we need to go back to the end of World War II. Most of Europe was devastated. Japan was rebuilding. Entire economies had been destroyed. The United States was different. Its factories were intact. Its economy was booming. It held an enormous share of the world's gold. In 1944, representatives from dozens of countries met in Bretton Woods. They needed a new financial system. The solution they built placed the US dollar at its center. Countries tied their currencies to the dollar. The dollar itself was linked to gold. The arrangement wasn't perfect, but it created stability. Businesses finally knew what currencies were worth. Trade expanded. Investment exploded. Then came 1971. President Richard Nixon ended the dollar's direct connection to gold. Many expected the system to collapse. Instead, something unexpected happened. The dollar became even stronger, because by then, trust had quietly replaced gold. Global trade had already adapted. Banks had already built around it. Financial markets had already become dependent on it. Changing everything would have been like replacing the internet overnight. Possible in theory, almost impossible in practice. Then another layer was added: oil. Throughout the following decades, most international oil contracts were priced in dollars. That meant every country importing energy needed access to dollars. The world wasn't simply using American currency. It needed American currency. And that's where money slowly transformed into influence. Imagine you're running a global marketplace. Everyone enters through the same gate. Now imagine you own that gate. You don't control every buyer. You don't control every seller. But you do control access. That's essentially what happened. Because the dollar isn't just paper. It's connected to a gigantic financial network. American banks, global clearing systems, treasury markets, payment infrastructure, international lending. Most people think sanctions work because governments make announcements. In reality, sanctions work because money has to move. And much of the world's money eventually touches the dollar system. If access disappears, international business becomes dramatically harder. That's exactly why countries fear financial sanctions almost as much as military ones. Russia experienced this after its invasion of Ukraine. Iran has faced similar restrictions for years. Other governments have watched carefully because suddenly everyone realized something uncomfortable. The reserve currency isn't just a convenience. It's leverage. But here's where the story becomes more interesting. This power doesn't only affect governments. It affects ordinary people. Suppose a company in Indonesia borrows dollars because interest rates are cheaper. Business is good. Everything looks fine. Then the dollar strengthens. Now repaying that same loan becomes far more expensive. Nothing changed inside the company. Only the value of the dollar changed. Suddenly profits disappear. Hiring slows. Investment stops. The same thing happens across thousands of companies. Across dozens of countries. One currency moves. Entire economies react. That's an astonishing amount of influence for something that most people think of as cash inside a wallet. Now consider America's debt. The United States owes an enormous amount of money. Far more than many people find comfortable. Normally, investors would become nervous. Borrowing costs would soar. Confidence would collapse. Except something unusual happens. When global uncertainty rises, money often runs toward America, not away from it. Financial crisis? Investors buy dollars. Va? Investors buy dollars. Bank failures? Investors buy dollars. Recession fears? Investors buy dollars. It's almost backwards. The very events that scare investors often strengthen the currency at the center of the system. Why? Because safety is relative. The dollar isn't trusted because America is perfect. It's trusted because investors believe it's still safer than the alternatives. That's a very different standard. People don't need to believe the dollar is flawless. They simply need to believe everything else carries greater risk. This creates what economists sometimes call an exorbitant privilege. America can borrow enormous sums at lower costs than many other countries. Demand for U.S. Treasury bonds remains high because governments, banks, pension funds, and central banks need dollar assets. That demand gives Washington flexibility that very few nations enjoy. But every advantage creates incentives for others to reduce their dependence. Over the past decade, conversations about de-dollarization have grown louder. Countries have experimented with settling trade in local currencies. Central banks have diversified some of their reserves. Regional payment systems have expanded. China has promoted wider use of its currency. The euro remains an important alternative in many markets. At first glance, it sounds like the dollar's dominance is ending. Reality is more complicated. Building a reserve currency isn't like launching a new smartphone. It requires deep financial markets, reliable legal systems, political stability, open capital markets, global trust built over decades. Most importantly, it requires everyone else believing everyone else will keep using it. That's incredibly difficult to replace. Networks become stronger as more people join them. Money follows the same rule. Ironically, the dollar's greatest strength may not be America itself. It may be the fact that replacing the system would be extraordinarily expensive for everyone involved. Still, history offers a warning. No dominant currency has remained on top forever. The Dutch guilder once dominated global trade. Then came the British pound. Eventually, the dollar replaced both. Every monetary empire has looked permanent until it wasn't. The real question isn't whether the dollar will eventually lose influence. History suggests every system changes. The harder question is what replaces it. One dominant currency? Several regional currencies? Digital central bank money? Or a fragmented financial world where no single country holds the same level of power? Nobody knows. What we do know is this. The world's most powerful weapon isn't always carried by a soldier. Sometimes it's held by a central bank. Sometimes it moves through invisible payment networks. Sometimes it exists as numbers flowing across computer screens at the speed of light. And as long as the world continues speaking the language of the dollar, the United States will possess a kind of influence that armies alone could never buy. The only unanswered question is this. When the world finally decides to speak a different financial language, who gets to write the dictionary?